People think a family begins with a grand promise, but sometimes it begins with a stranger rolling down the passenger side window and asking one simple question: "Need a ride?" The applause echoed across the high school football field as rows of graduates in navy caps and gowns searched the crowd for familiar faces, but I barely heard any of it because my eyes were fixed on one young man weaving through the sea of students with the widest grin I had ever seen. Liam Brooks was 18 now, nearly 6 feet tall, confident, kind, and somehow still carrying the same bright smile that had melted every wall his father spent years trying to build around his heart. When he finally reached us, he wrapped both arms around me before turning to hug his dad. "We did it," he laughed, and then, without thinking, he looked at me and said the word that still caught me off guard every single time: "Dad." Noah smiled quietly beside us, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way they never used to. Years ago, I would have believed that moment belonged in somebody else's life. Back then, Noah Brooks was the quiet single father who lived 3 houses down from mine. We exchanged polite nods when taking out the trash or checking the mail, but that was about it. He always kept to himself. His front lawn was perfectly trimmed, his porch lights switched on every evening at exactly 7, and every Saturday morning, he washed the same aging blue SUV while Liam sat nearby drawing superheroes with sidewalk chalk. It looked like an ordinary life from the outside, but there was something about Noah that felt different. He carried silence the way some people carried heavy boxes, carefully balanced so no one would notice how exhausting it had become. I never imagined I would become part of that silence, much less help replace it with laughter. The strange thing is, none of it started with a confession, a dramatic encounter, or some magical coincidence. It started because an engine refused to cooperate on an unusually chilly October morning. I still remember the air smelling like damp leaves and fresh coffee as I backed my old silver Honda Civic out of the driveway at 7:15 sharp, already running 5 minutes behind for another day teaching middle school art. The neighborhood was waking up slowly. Sprinklers clicked across neat green lawns. A golden retriever barked somewhere down the block. School buses rumbled through nearby intersections while the first rays of sunlight painted the maple trees shades of orange and gold. That was when I spotted them. Noah stood beside his SUV with the hood raised, one hand resting on the edge of the engine compartment while the other held his phone. Liam shifted nervously beside him, backpack hanging from one shoulder, glancing toward the street every few seconds as if hoping another solution might magically appear. Noah looked calm on the surface, but even from across the road, I noticed the tightness in his shoulders. It was the expression of someone completely unwilling to ask anyone for help. I slowed my car without really thinking about it. Maybe it was because Liam looked worried. Maybe it was because my mother had always taught me that kindness usually arrived disguised as inconvenience. Or maybe, although I wouldn't admit it until much later, something about the quiet man down the street had already begun pulling at my attention long before either of us realized our story had quietly started. I pulled my car to the curb and lowered the passenger side window before Noah even noticed I had stopped. He looked up with the same guarded expression I had seen every time we crossed paths in the neighborhood, polite but distant, as though every conversation came with an invisible time limit. Liam recognized me first. His face brightened immediately. "Hi, Mr. Carter," he called with a cheerful wave that somehow made the quiet morning feel warmer. I smiled back. "Looks like you two could use a lift." Noah glanced toward the open hood of the SUV before looking back at me. "Thank you, but I do not want to inconvenience you." His voice was calm, almost practiced, the kind of voice that sounded like it had learned never to ask for favors. I shrugged. "You would actually be helping me. I get to use the carpool lane if I have passengers." It was not entirely true, but the tiny excuse seemed easier for him to accept than simple kindness. Liam looked hopefully at his father. "Dad, we are going to be late." Noah hesitated for another moment before quietly closing the hood of the SUV. "All right," he said. "Just this once." The drive began in complete silence. Liam sat in the back seat looking out the window while Noah folded his hands neatly in his lap, as though he were afraid to leave fingerprints on anything that belonged to someone else. I turned down the radio until only soft acoustic guitar filled the background. After a minute, Liam leaned forward between the seats. "Mr. Carter, is it true you teach art?" I laughed. "I do. Mostly 7th graders who think glue is a food group." Liam burst into laughter, and even Noah looked toward the windshield with what almost resembled the beginning of a smile. I like drawing, Liam admitted. Dad keeps every picture I make. Noah cleared his throat quietly. They deserve a better storage system than my kitchen drawer. That sounds like the perfect gallery to me, I replied. The rest of the drive became easier after that. Liam talked about his favorite comic books, his science teacher, and the stray orange cat that visited their porch every afternoon. Noah spoke only when necessary, but whenever Liam shared another story, I caught Noah watching him through the rearview mirror with quiet pride. It was the kind of love that never needed to announce itself. When we reached the elementary school, Liam climbed out first, then suddenly turned back toward my window. Thank you for saving us. I smiled. Have a great day, buddy. He hurried inside with the endless energy only children seem to possess. Noah remained standing beside my car for a second longer. You really did not have to stop, he said softly. Maybe not, I answered, but I am glad I did. He studied my face as though trying to understand whether I expected something in return. When he realized I did not, his shoulders relaxed just enough for me to notice. Thank you, Ethan. It was the first time he had called me by my first name. Somehow those two simple words felt far more important than the ride itself. As he stepped out of the car outside his office, building a few minutes later, he paused before closing the door. Hopefully my mechanic can fix the SUV today. If not, I replied with an easy smile. I leave for work at 7:15 every morning. Noah nodded once, almost automatically, then stopped himself as though accepting regular help was unfamiliar territory. I will keep that in mind. He shut the door gently and walked toward the glass entrance without looking back, but something told me that morning had changed more than either of us understood. Some people entered your life with loud celebrations. Others arrived so quietly that you only recognized the beginning after it had already become part of your routine. The mechanic did fix the sport utility vehicle that afternoon, but somehow that did not stop our paths from crossing again. 2 mornings later, as I carried my travel mug toward my car, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Good morning, Ethan. I turned to see Noah locking his front door while Liam adjusted the straps on his backpack. The SUV was sitting perfectly fine in the driveway. Looks like everything is working again, I said with a smile. Noah nodded. It is. Liam insisted we should still walk over and say thank you properly. Liam stepped forward with the confidence only a child could have and handed me a paper bag. Dad baked blueberry muffins. Noah immediately looked embarrassed. They're from a boxed mix. Nothing impressive. I accepted the bag anyway. I teach teenagers every day. Trust me, free breakfast is always impressive. Liam laughed so hard that Noah actually let out a quiet chuckle before catching himself. It was brief, almost invisible, but I noticed it. Over the next few weeks, our conversations became part of the rhythm of the neighborhood. Some mornings we talked for only 30 seconds while collecting the mail. Other evenings we ended up standing on the sidewalk as the sun disappeared behind rows of maple trees, discussing everything from favorite baseball teams to whether the city would ever repair the potholes on our street. Noah never volunteered much about himself, but he listened carefully whenever I spoke. It was a rare kind of attention that made ordinary conversations feel meaningful. Liam, meanwhile, acted as though we had been friends for years. Whenever he spotted me outside, he ran over carrying whatever project currently fascinated him. One afternoon, it was a model rocket built from cardboard tubes. Another day, it was a sketchbook filled with surprisingly detailed drawings of neighborhood houses. Do you think I could become an artist? He asked while sitting on the front steps between Noah and me. I think you can become anything if you keep enjoying the process, I answered. The best artists never stop being curious. Liam nodded thoughtfully before racing across the lawn to chase the orange neighborhood cat that had once again appeared without invitation. Noah watched him with quiet affection. Thank you, he said softly, for encouraging him. It is easy, I replied. He is a wonderful kid. Noah looked down at his hands. He deserves more than I know how to give. The words escaped before he could pull them back, and for a second I caught a glimpse of the weight he carried every day. From what I have seen, I said carefully, he already has something many children wish they had. He knows his father is always there. Noah did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Liam kneeling in the grass, patiently trying to convince the cat to accept the tiny plastic superhero cape. Finally, a faint smile crossed his face. He has always been the brave one, Noah admitted. Autumn slowly settled over the neighborhood. Front porches filled with pumpkins, cool evenings arrived earlier each week, and the scent of cinnamon drifted from nearby kitchens. Without either of us planning it, small favors became ordinary. I watered Noah's flowers when he worked late. He shoveled my driveway after the season's first snowfall before I even woke up. We stopped keeping score because there was nothing to measure. Somewhere between shared muffins, sidewalk conversations, and simple acts of kindness, the distance that had once existed between our houses quietly disappeared, even if neither of us was quite ready to admit that something much deeper was beginning to grow. By the time December arrived, I realized something unusual had happened. I no longer noticed when Noah was quiet because his silence had become familiar instead of uncomfortable. It carried meaning now. I could tell the difference between the silence of exhaustion after a long day at work, the silence of deep thought while watching Liam finish his homework, and the rare silence that settled over him whenever something invisible seemed to pull him somewhere far beyond our little neighborhood. It was on one of those evenings that I first understood how much of himself he still kept hidden. A light snow had begun falling just after dinner, covering the sidewalks in a thin white blanket that reflected the glow of Christmas decorations hanging from nearby houses. I was outside untangling a string of lights when Liam ran across the yard wearing an oversized knit hat that kept slipping over his eyes. "Dad says the hot chocolate is ready if you want some," he announced before racing back toward the house without waiting for an answer. Inside, the Brooks home felt exactly like Noah himself, neat, warm, and simple. There were framed photographs on the shelves, stacks of library books on the coffee table, and the comforting smell of cinnamon drifting from the kitchen. Liam disappeared upstairs to finish a school project, leaving Noah and me alone with steaming mugs resting between our hands. Soft holiday music played somewhere in the background. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the snow collecting outside the front window. Finally, I noticed a photograph sitting slightly apart from the others. It showed a younger Noah standing beside another man with an easy smile, both of them holding a toddler who could only have been Liam. The picture had faded around the edges from being handled too often. Noah followed my eyes and quietly reached for the frame. His thumb brushed across the glass before he spoke. His name was Daniel. There was no hesitation in his voice, only tenderness. He was Liam's father. I nodded gently, allowing the silence to remain until Noah chose to continue. Daniel passed away when Liam was 3. It was an illness that came much faster than anyone expected. He stared at the photograph with the distant expression I had seen so many times before but never understood. After that, every decision became about keeping life steady for Liam. School, meals, bedtime stories, soccer practice. I convinced myself that if I focused hard enough on taking care of him, I would not have to think about everything else. He gave a quiet laugh that carried more sadness than humor. It worked for a while. I looked toward the staircase where Liam's footsteps echoed faintly above us. "He is a remarkable kid," I said. "He learned that from both of you." Noah lowered his eyes. "Sometimes I worry he remembers Daniel less every year. Sometimes I worry that if I ever smiled too much again, it would mean I was leaving part of our life behind." His honesty settled heavily between us. I understood then that his distance had never been about rejecting the people around him. It had been about protecting memories he was afraid would disappear if he allowed himself to be happy again. I leaned back in my chair and smiled softly. I do not think love works that way. I think the people who shape us become part of every good thing we build afterward. Noah looked at me for a long moment. His guarded expression softened in a way I had never seen before, not because the sadness was gone, but because for the first time he seemed willing to let someone else stand beside him while carrying it. Upstairs, Liam laughed at something on his computer, and the sound filled the quiet house with life. Noah listened, smiled gently, and whispered almost to himself, "He would have liked you." After that evening, nothing between us changed overnight, and somehow that made everything feel more genuine. Noah did not suddenly become outgoing, and I did not expect him to. Instead, life continued offering us ordinary moments that slowly stitched themselves into something neither of us could have planned. The first Saturday after New Year's Day, Liam knocked on my front door before 9 o'clock, carrying a board game under one arm and wearing the same oversized knit hat that still slipped over his eyes. "Dad says you are officially invited to family game night," he announced with Complete confidence. Apparently saying no is not an option. I laughed as I grabbed my jacket. That sounds like a very serious invitation. When we walked into the Brooks house, Noah looked up from the kitchen with an expression that mixed amusement and quiet embarrassment. I told him you were welcome if you were free. He heard everything after the word welcome, I replied. The rest was inevitable. Noah smiled, a little more naturally this time. Dinner was simple. Homemade chili, fresh cornbread, and the blueberry muffins that had somehow become a tradition every other weekend. Conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before. Liam eagerly described a science project involving homemade volcanoes, while I admitted that one of my students had accidentally painted an entire classroom sink bright purple. Even Noah contributed stories from work, describing coworkers who somehow managed to misplace tools that were larger than most kitchen tables. For the first time, laughter did not feel like an unexpected guest inside his home. It belonged there. Later that evening, the three of us sat around the dining room table playing an old board game that Liam insisted he understood far better than either adult. He celebrated every small victory with dramatic enthusiasm and accepted every defeat with exaggerated sighs that made both Noah and me laugh. At one point, he looked from his father to me and frowned thoughtfully. You know, he said, Dad laughs a lot more now. Noah nearly dropped the game pieces in his hand. Liam, it is true. Liam continued without hesitation. Before, the house was always really quiet. Now it sounds different. Noah lowered his eyes, clearly unsure how to respond. I rescued him with a smile. Maybe you have just become funnier. Liam grinned proudly. I knew it. The evening ended later than I realized. As I stood on the porch getting ready to leave, snowflakes drifted lazily through the porch light. Noah stepped outside with me while Liam hurried upstairs to brush his teeth. For a few moments, we simply watched the quiet street. Thank you, Noah said softly. Not for tonight. For all of it. I looked at him with genuine confusion. I have not really done anything extraordinary. He shook his head. That is exactly why it matters. You never tried to fix our lives. You just became part of them. His words stayed with me long after I walked home across the snow-covered lawns. A few days later, I found a folded drawing tucked beneath my front door. It was clearly Liam's work. 3 figures stood together under a bright blue sky outside 2 neighboring houses connected by a winding sidewalk. Above them, written in careful block letters, were the words, "Good neighbors become good friends." I smiled as I pinned the picture to my refrigerator, never realizing that Liam had quietly drawn the future long before either Noah or I had found the courage to see it for ourselves. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, and with every passing week our lives became woven together through routines so ordinary that they almost escaped notice. Every Wednesday evening Liam came to my house for an hour while Noah attended a late project meeting across town. We finished homework at my kitchen table, experimented with watercolor paintings that usually left more color on our hands than the paper, and ended each visit with grilled cheese sandwiches that Liam insisted were better because they were cut into triangles. Noah always arrived exactly when he promised, always thanked me with quiet sincerity, and always stayed just long enough to hear Liam excitedly retell every detail of the evening. It felt effortless, almost as though we had known each other far longer than a few months. Then, one Friday afternoon, something shifted. I was leaving the grocery store with 2 paper bags balanced against my chest when I spotted Noah standing near the entrance speaking with a man I had never seen before. The stranger looked to be around our age, dressed in business clothes, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone reconnecting with an old friend. Noah seemed surprised to see him, but there was also warmth in his expression. I started to wave before realizing they were deep in conversation, so I quietly loaded my groceries into the car and drove home. Later that evening, Noah canceled our usual Friday dinner. His text was polite and brief. He explained that someone from his past had unexpectedly come into town and asked to meet for coffee, and he hoped we could reschedule another time. There was nothing unusual about the message, yet I found myself reading it twice before setting my phone aside. The next few days felt different. Noah still greeted me whenever we crossed paths, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. He seemed distracted, as though his thoughts remained somewhere else entirely. Liam noticed it too. On Sunday afternoon, he wandered into my backyard while I was planting flowers along the fence. He sat quietly on the porch steps without saying anything for several minutes, which was unusual for him. Finally, he sighed. Dad has been thinking a lot lately. I brushed the dirt from my hands and joined him on the steps. Did something happen? Liam shrugged. A man named Michael came to visit. They used to know each other a long time ago. Ever since then, Dad has been looking at old photo albums every night. I nodded slowly but did not press for more. Children often notice changes long before adults admitted them out loud. That evening, I saw Noah sitting alone on his front porch after sunset, a small cardboard box resting beside his chair. From where I stood across the yard, I could see photographs spread across his lap. He turned each one carefully, lingering over memories that only he could fully understand. I thought about walking over, but something told me he needed space more than company. So instead I switched on my porch light, hoping the quiet glow across the lawn might be enough to remind him he was not alone. He looked up for just a moment and noticed the light. Our eyes met across the peaceful street. He offered a faint nod before returning to the photographs. It was a tiny gesture, almost invisible to anyone else, but I understood what it meant. Sometimes people could not ask for comfort with words. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was simply remain close enough that they knew they would not have to face tomorrow by themselves. The following week settled over the neighborhood with an unfamiliar stillness. Noah still waved when we passed each other, but the easy rhythm we had built together seemed to hesitate, as though both of us were waiting for something neither one knew how to say. I respected that distance because caring about someone sometimes meant allowing them the room to sort through their own thoughts. I kept teaching my classes, grading sketchbooks late into the evening, and waving whenever Liam rode his bicycle past my driveway after school. The routines remained, but they felt quieter than before. Then one Wednesday afternoon, Liam arrived at my front door carrying his backpack and a folded piece of paper instead of his usual smile. He placed it on my kitchen counter while I prepared grilled cheese sandwiches. I made something, he said, but I do not think Dad liked it. I unfolded the paper carefully. It was another drawing. This time there were only 3 figures again, but the 2 adults stood farther apart than before while the child stretched both arms toward them. Above the picture, Liam had written, in careful handwriting, "Families are happier when nobody stands alone." I looked at him gently. "Did your dad say he did not like it?" Liam shook his head. "No." He looked at it for a long time, smiled a little, and then put it in his desk drawer. After that, he got really quiet again. Children often understood feelings better than adults realized. They noticed pauses, unfinished sentences, and smiles that disappeared too quickly. I set the drawing back on the table. Sometimes grown-ups need extra time to think about things that matter. Liam rested his chin in his hands. "Do you think he is afraid?" The question surprised me because it sounded far older than his years. I answered honestly. "I think everyone feels afraid sometimes. The brave part is deciding what to do after that." Liam nodded slowly, storing the thought away with the quiet seriousness that made him seem so much like his father. That evening, after Noah picked him up, I noticed the porch light at the Brooks house remained off for the first time in months. The darkness caught my attention immediately. Without thinking too much about it, I baked a loaf of banana bread using my grandmother's recipe and left it on their front step with a short handwritten note that simply said, "No need to answer the door. Just thought you might enjoy dessert." I walked back home before anyone could thank me. About an hour later, there was a soft knock. When I opened the door, nobody was there, but my empty baking dish rested neatly on the welcome mat. Inside it sat a folded note written in Noah's careful handwriting. "Thank you for understanding that silence is not the same as absence." I read the sentence twice before slipping it into my jacket pocket. The next morning, as I stepped outside to leave for work, I saw Noah standing at the edge of his driveway with a travel mug in one hand. He looked tired, but there was a quiet determination in his expression that had not been there the day before. He waited until I reached my car before speaking. "Michael reminded me of who I used to be," he said thoughtfully. "You remind me of who I still have the chance to become." Neither of us said anything after that. We did not need to. Some conversations changed a life not because they were long, but because they finally made room for hope to speak louder than fear. Spring arrived with longer evenings, flowering dogwood trees, and the comforting feeling that our quiet neighborhood had finally shaken off the weight of winter. A few days after our conversation by the driveway, Noah knocked on my front door just after sunset. It was unusual enough that I almost expected something to be wrong, but when I opened the door, He simply stood there with his hands tucked into the pockets of his light jacket and a thoughtful expression on his face. "I hope I am not interrupting anything," he said. "Not at all," I answered. "Everything all right?" He let out a slow breath before giving a small smile. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something." I waited patiently. He glanced toward my old silver Honda Civic parked beside the curb and gave a quiet laugh at himself. "Would you mind giving me a ride tomorrow morning?" I blinked in surprise. "Your sport utility vehicle broke down again." He shook his head. "No, it is working perfectly." For a second, he searched for the right words, and I could almost see the careful walls he had carried for so many years lowering one brick at a time. I just realized that the best conversations I have had in a very long time all seem to happen while sitting beside you in that passenger seat. I could not help smiling. Then I would be happy to drive. The next morning felt strangely familiar, almost like stepping back into the beginning of a story while understanding it completely differently. Noah climbed into the passenger seat carrying 2 travel mugs filled with coffee. "I figured I could contribute this time," he said as he handed one to me. We pulled away from the curb just as the neighborhood began to wake. The streets were lined with blooming trees instead of autumn leaves now, and children waited at bus stops wearing light jackets instead of winter coats. For several minutes, we simply enjoyed the peaceful drive. The silence between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt comfortable, earned through countless ordinary days spent learning one another without pressure or expectation. Finally, Noah looked out the window and spoke. "Michael apologized for disappearing after Daniel became sick. He carried his own guilt for years." He paused before continuing. "Seeing him again made me realize something I had been avoiding." I kept my attention on the road, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "I spent so much time trying to protect the life Daniel and I built that I forgot he never wanted Liam or me to stop living. Holding on to love is not the same as holding on to grief." His words settled gently inside the quiet car. "That sounds like an important difference," I replied. He nodded. "It is." We reached his office much sooner than either of us expected. Instead of opening the door immediately, Noah remained seated for another moment. "Thank you for never asking me to move on," he said softly. "You simply walked beside me until I was ready to move forward." I smiled. "You did all the hard work yourself." He shook his head with quiet certainty. "No, Ethan. I only found the courage because every time I looked beside me, you were still there." As he stepped out of the car, he hesitated once more before leaning back. Through the open door, "Would you and I like to take Liam to the county fair this Saturday?" There was a warmth in the way he said the words that made the invitation feel like far more than a weekend plan. It was not simply an afternoon at the fair. It was the first time Noah was no longer inviting me into a moment. He was inviting me into the future he had finally decided he wanted us to build together. The county fair became one of those days that seemed ordinary while it was happening, but grew more meaningful every time I remembered it afterward. Liam insisted we ride the Ferris wheel before doing anything else, claiming the view from the top made every problem seem smaller. Noah laughed and admitted he had never enjoyed heights, yet he climbed into the gondola beside us anyway, because saying no to Liam had always been one of the few things he could never manage. As the wheel lifted us above the fairgrounds, colorful lights stretched across the evening like tiny stars, families wandered between food stands, and cheerful music drifted through the warm spring air. Liam looked out over the town with complete wonder before turning toward us with the brightest smile imaginable. "This is my favorite day all year," he declared. Noah glanced at me, and I realized his smile carried something new. It was no longer cautious or borrowed. It was peaceful. The months that followed never included dramatic declarations or perfect movie moments. Instead, they were filled with little choices that quietly transformed 3 separate lives into one shared story. I kept an extra coffee mug in my kitchen because Noah stopped by most mornings before work. He eventually stopped knocking and simply called out a friendly greeting as he walked in through the back door. Liam's drawings slowly covered my refrigerator, then the hallway, until visitors joked that my house looked like a neighborhood art gallery. Holidays were no longer divided between separate homes because celebrating together became the most natural decision in the world. One Saturday afternoon, while we were repainting the old wooden fence between our yards, Liam looked up from his paintbrush and frowned. "Why are we fixing both sides?" Noah smiled before I could answer. "Because it stopped being 2 fences a long time ago." Liam nodded as though that explanation made perfect sense. In many ways, it did. The invisible line that had once separated our lives had quietly disappeared without either of us noticing exactly when it happened. Another year passed, and the blue sport utility vehicle finally gave Noah more mechanical problems than it was worth. When he bought a newer vehicle, he surprised me by refusing to trade in the old one immediately. Too many memories, he admitted with an amused smile. Every now and then we still drove it around the neighborhood on quiet Sunday afternoons simply because Liam insisted it was lucky. Maybe he was right. After all, that aging vehicle had unknowingly carried the beginning of everything that mattered. Time continued moving forward, just as it always does. Seasons changed. Liam grew taller than both of us. My classroom filled with new students every fall, and Noah continued building projects across the city while somehow always making it home in time for dinner. Then, before I knew it, we found ourselves standing together on the high school football field once again as graduates searched the crowd for the people who had shaped their lives. Liam reached us first, wrapping both of us in one enthusiastic embrace before holding up his diploma with unmistakable pride. "We did it," he said with a laugh that sounded exactly like the little boy who had once raced across the lawn wearing an oversized knit hat. Then he looked at me with complete certainty and smiled. "Ready to go home, Dad?" I looked at Noah, and he answered with the same quiet expression that had first caught my attention years earlier, except now there was no loneliness hiding behind it. He slipped his hand gently into mine, and together we followed Liam toward the parking lot where an old silver Honda Civic and a well-loved blue sport utility vehicle waited side by side beneath the evening sky. Looking at them, I could not help smiling, because sometimes the smallest act of kindness did not simply change a single day. Sometimes it quietly became the road that led an ordinary stranger all the way home. Life has a quiet way of proving that the happiest endings are not really endings at all. They are simply the beginning of ordinary days that slowly become the memories people treasure most. A few months after Liam graduated from high school, our neighborhood gathered for its annual summer block party. Children chased one another across freshly cut lawns. Neighbors shared homemade desserts on folding tables, and live music drifted through the warm evening air while the sun settled behind the trees. It was the same street where I had once noticed a stranded sport utility vehicle and a quiet father who seemed determined to carry every burden by himself. Standing there now, it was almost impossible to believe how much had changed without either of us forcing any of it. Liam had accepted an offer from a state university less than 2 hours away, close enough to visit often, but far enough to begin building a future of his own. As excited as he was, I occasionally caught him looking around the house with a thoughtful expression, as though he was already storing away familiar moments before life carried him somewhere new. One afternoon, while packing books into cardboard boxes, he held up the old drawing he had made years earlier, showing 3 figures standing between 2 neighboring houses. The paper had faded slightly around the edges, but the words were still easy to read. "Good neighbors become good friends." He smiled before carefully placing it into a protective folder. "I think I got this one wrong," he said. Noah looked up from sealing another box. "How so?" Liam laughed softly. "Because you two became a lot more than friends." Noah glanced toward me, his eyes filled with the same quiet warmth that had become so familiar over the years. "Some lessons take a while to understand," he replied. The night before Liam left for college, the 3 of us sat on the back porch watching fireflies appear one by one across the yard. Nobody seemed eager to interrupt the peaceful silence. Eventually, Liam leaned back in his chair and asked the kind of question that only arrived after years of living together. "Do you know what I remember most from when I was little?" Noah smiled. "Probably all the times I made you eat vegetables." "Definitely not," Liam answered with a grin. He turned toward me. "I remember looking out the front window one morning and seeing a silver Honda stop by the curb. I thought it was just someone giving us a ride. I had no idea I was watching my family arrive." His words settled gently over all 3 of us. Noah reached across the small table and rested his hand in mine without hesitation, a gesture so natural now that neither of us even thought about it anymore. "Neither did I," he admitted quietly. "I spent years believing life only moved in one direction, away from the people you loved. Then one ordinary morning someone reminded me that sometimes life also brings people toward you." I smiled, thinking back to the sound of a struggling engine, a nervous little boy with a backpack hanging from one shoulder, and a man who found it almost impossible to accept help. None of us could have predicted where that simple decision would lead. We only knew that kindness had asked for almost nothing in return except the willingness to stop, roll down a window, and make room for someone else. Looking around at the home we had built together, I realized that love had never arrived all at once. It had quietly grown inside shared breakfasts, school projects, long conversations, repaired fences, handwritten notes, and countless ordinary mornings that slowly became extraordinary simply because we experienced them together. And if there was one lesson our story had taught me, it was that the strongest families are not always the ones people are born into. Sometimes they are the ones patiently built, one small act of kindness at a time. The house felt noticeably quieter after Liam left for college, but it was never empty. His room remained just as he had left it, with shelves lined with sketchbooks, science trophies, and the faded drawing that had once predicted a future none of us could fully imagine. Noah refused to call it a guest room. "He still lives here," he would say whenever someone suggested we turn it into an office. "He is just borrowing another address for a while." I understood exactly what he meant. Every Sunday evening, without fail, Liam called while driving back to campus after spending the weekend with us. Sometimes he talked for nearly an hour about professors who inspired him, classmates who had become friends, or the endless challenge of balancing assignments with part-time work at the university library. Other times he simply wanted to hear familiar voices before another busy week began. Those conversations became part of our routine, just as meaningful as the shared breakfasts and evening walks that now filled our own days. Noah and I settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt less like creating a new life and more like continuing one that had quietly grown over the years. We planted vegetables in the backyard every spring, argued playfully over whose tomato plants were healthier, and spent Saturday mornings wandering through the local farmer's market carrying reusable bags that somehow always came home heavier than we expected. The neighbors had long since stopped referring to us as the two men living in separate houses. Somewhere along the way, everyone simply began saying, "Go ask Ethan and Noah," as though we had always belonged together. One crisp October afternoon, nearly 4 years after that first unexpected ride, I returned home from school to find Noah standing beside the old silver Honda with a bucket of soapy water and a garden hose. The little car had more miles on it than I cared to count, but it still started every morning with dependable determination. "I thought it deserved some attention," Noah said with a grin. "It has done a lot for this family." I laughed as I picked up a sponge and joined him. We spent the next hour washing every inch of the car while reminiscing about moments that had once seemed ordinary. We remembered the blueberry muffins, the science projects, the county fair, the snowy evenings, and the countless drives that had somehow become conversations neither of us could have predicted. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had kept driving that first morning?" Noah asked quietly as he dried the windshield. I looked at the reflection of the autumn trees shimmering across the clean glass before answering. "Sometimes. But then I remind myself that life is made from small choices." That morning I only chose to stop for a few minutes. Everything else happened because we kept choosing each other afterward. Noah smiled, his eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "I spent years believing I had already lived the happiest chapter of my life," he admitted. "Now I realize happiness was never limited to one chapter. It simply asked me to have the courage to keep turning the pages." Just then my phone rang. Liam's name appeared on the screen along with a smiling photo of him wearing his university sweatshirt. I answered immediately, and before I could even say hello, his excited voice filled the speaker. Dad, you both have to hear this." Noah looked at me with an amused smile as we listened together, standing beside the freshly washed car in the fading afternoon sunlight. In that simple moment, surrounded by familiar sounds and familiar love, I realized that home was never really a place waiting at the end of the road. Home was every ordinary day we chose to share with the people who made the journey worthwhile. Another 3 years passed almost without us noticing. Seasons continued to arrive exactly when they were supposed to. Flowers returned every spring, and the maple trees outside our house painted the neighborhood in brilliant shades of red and gold every autumn. The rhythm of our lives never became extraordinary in the way movies often imagine happiness, yet every ordinary day seemed to carry a quiet kind of magic. Liam visited whenever his university schedule allowed, usually arriving on Friday evenings with an overstuffed backpack, stories about campus life, and an appetite that somehow convinced Noah to cook enough food for twice the number of people sitting at the table. Those weekends quickly became our favorite tradition. We played board games that Liam still insisted he could never lose fairly, walked through the neighborhood after dinner, and laughed about memories that seemed impossible to explain to anyone who had not lived them alongside us. During one visit near the end of his junior year, Liam wandered into the garage, while Noah and I sorted through old storage boxes. He held up a dusty cardboard carton labeled simply, Keepsakes. Curiosity quickly replaced the dust. Together we opened it and discovered ticket stubs from the county fair, handmade Father's Day cards, faded elementary school artwork, neighborhood holiday photographs, and dozens of little reminders of a life carefully built one moment at a time. Buried near the bottom was the folded note I had once left beside a loaf of banana bread that read, "No need to answer the door. Just thought you might enjoy dessert." Noah smiled the instant he saw it. "I never told you this," he admitted, "but I carried that note in my wallet for almost 2 years." I looked at him in surprise. "You did?" He nodded with quiet embarrassment. There were days when I still believed everyone eventually walked away. Reading those few words reminded me that kindness could stay. Liam listened without interrupting, then carefully placed the note back inside the box as though it belonged in a museum. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I used to think families were created by birthdays or paperwork or sharing the same last name. Now I think families are created by showing up over and over again until love becomes the most ordinary thing in the house." Noah and I exchanged a glance, both smiling because the little boy who once wore an oversized knit hat had somehow grown into a young man with remarkable wisdom. A few weeks later, Liam invited us to attend an exhibition featuring student design projects at the university. As we wandered through displays filled with architecture models, engineering prototypes, and artwork, he proudly introduced us to professors and classmates without the slightest hesitation. "These are my dads," he said naturally, as though there had never been any other way to describe us. No explanation followed because none was needed. The simple confidence in his voice carried years of shared breakfasts, school mornings, repaired fences, quiet conversations, and countless ordinary choices that had slowly become an unshakable foundation. Driving home that evening, Noah reached across the center console and gently intertwined his fingers with mine. Outside the windshield, familiar roads stretched ahead beneath the fading sunset, leading back toward the neighborhood where everything had quietly begun. I smiled to myself, realizing that the greatest gift life had ever given me was never found inside one unforgettable moment. It had been hidden inside thousands of small ones that, together, became the kind of home every heart hopes to find. Several years have passed since that quiet October morning when I first noticed a father and his little boy standing beside a silent sport utility vehicle, and even now I sometimes find myself slowing down as I drive through our neighborhood, smiling at the memory of a moment that once seemed so ordinary. The streets have changed in small ways. Young trees have grown tall enough to cast generous shade across the sidewalks. New families have moved into homes that once belonged to familiar faces. Children who used to ride bicycles after school now return home from college during the holidays. Life continues exactly as it always has, gently reminding us that time never stands still. Yet some things remain beautifully unchanged. Every Saturday morning, Noah still makes coffee before I wake up because he insists mine never tastes quite right. I still leave little sketches on the refrigerator whenever I think he has had a particularly demanding week at work, and he still pretends not to notice them until the following morning, when he quietly smiles while pouring cereal into his bowl. Those tiny traditions have become the language of our life together. Simple gestures repeated so often that they no longer feel remarkable, even though they mean everything. Liam eventually graduated from college and accepted a position with an engineering firm not far from home. The first thing he did after receiving his offer was drive straight to our house, carrying a bakery box filled with chocolate cupcakes. He placed the letter on the kitchen table, hugged Noah, hugged me, and laughed. "Looks like I am staying close enough to keep stealing your Sunday dinners." Noah smiled with unmistakable relief. "That sounds like an excellent career decision." Some evenings the three of us still sit on the back porch watching the sunset settle over the neighborhood while sharing stories from our day. Other evenings, friends and neighbors stop by unexpectedly, filling the backyard with conversation, laughter, and the comfortable feeling that our home has become the kind of place where everyone feels welcome. Every now and then someone new asks how Noah and I first met. They usually expect an unforgettable story filled with dramatic twists or extraordinary coincidence. Instead, we exchange the same amused glance before Noah answers with complete honesty. My car would not start. People laugh because they assume he is joking, but he never changes his answer. The truth has never needed embellishment. One quiet autumn afternoon, I found the old silver Honda parked beside the garage while Noah carefully polished its faded hood. We had long since stopped driving it every day, but neither of us had ever considered letting it go. I walked over and rested my hand beside his. "Still taking care of the old friend?" I asked. He smiled warmly. "Some things deserve to be remembered." He closed the driver's door, looked at me with the same gentle eyes that no longer carried loneliness, and slipped his hand into mine. Together we stood in the driveway as the evening breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the neighborhood. Across the street, children laughed while learning to ride their bicycles, their parents cheering them on from nearby sidewalks. Watching them, I realized our story had never really been about one ride, one conversation, or even one decision. It had always been about choosing kindness before certainty, choosing patience before fear, and choosing to remain present through every ordinary day that followed. Looking back now, I understand that love rarely arrives with perfect timing or dramatic fanfare. More often, it appears quietly, wearing everyday clothes, asking for nothing more than a little compassion and an empty passenger seat. And if someone had told me all those years ago that one simple act of stopping my car would eventually lead me to the family I never knew I was missing, I probably would have smiled politely and driven away. I am endlessly grateful that, on that particular morning, I decided instead to roll down the window and stay.